They thought they were fine without you. They told themselves they were independent, strong, emotionally detached, and that needing someone was weakness. They believed that love was optional, connection was dangerous, and closeness was something to be controlled. But now the silence is loud. Now the room feels empty. Now the nights are longer. And for the first time, they are feeling something they never expected to feel so deeply: loneliness. They didn't realize what you were to them when you were still there. They didn't understand your value when you were still trying, still caring, still loving, still staying. They only understood when the presence they took for granted disappeared. This is the paradox of avoidant psychology. They often feel loss only when it's too late. If you ever loved someone who kept you at a distance, who pulled away when things got real, who shut down when you opened up, then this message is for you. Because while they were pushing you away, they were unknowingly pushing away the one thing they secretly needed most. And now they're lonely. Loneliness doesn't arrive for avoidance the way it arrives for others. While you were in the relationship, they may have felt crowded, overwhelmed, suffocated, or pressured by emotional closeness. Your love may have felt intense, demanding, or too real. But once you're gone, once the texts stop, once your emotional presence disappears, something shifts inside them. The quiet becomes unbearable. The emotional distance they once craved becomes a void. They sit alone and realize that no one is checking on them. No one is asking how they feel. No one is waiting for them to open up. And that realization hits in waves. At first, they distract themselves. They stay busy. They scroll. They date. They work. They numb. But in quiet moments, the memory of you creeps in. They remember how you listened, how you cared, how you tried to understand them when they couldn't even understand themselves. And that's when loneliness stops being theoretical and becomes emotional. It becomes personal. It becomes heavy. What they never realized was how rare your emotional presence was. They didn't recognize it while you were there because to an avoidant, love feels normal only when it's distant. Closeness feels threatening. Emotional availability feels risky. So instead of valuing what you gave, they minimized it, dismissed it, or pushed it away. They thought your patience would last forever. They assumed your loyalty was guaranteed. They believed you would always be there, even when they were inconsistent, cold, or emotionally unavailable. They didn't realize that love without connection slowly erodes, and even the most patient heart eventually walks away. Avoidants are wired differently. Their mind learned, often early in life, that emotional closeness equals pain, rejection, or loss of autonomy, so they developed a strategy. Don't get too close, don't depend on anyone, don't show vulnerability, and don't let anyone see your true emotional needs. This strategy protects them from feeling overwhelmed, but it also isolates them from deep connection. When you tried to get close, when you asked for reassurance, when you expressed your feelings, they felt their internal alarm system activate. Instead of seeing intimacy as safety, they saw it as danger. So they shut down, pulled away, changed the subject, or emotionally disappeared. But what they never realized is that you weren't trying to trap them. You weren't trying to control them. You weren't trying to take away their independence. You were trying to connect. You were trying to love. You were trying to build something real. You were their emotional anchor, but they saw you as pressure. You were their stability, but they saw you as boredom. You were their safe place, but they saw you as restriction, and that misunderstanding is what ultimately pushed you away. You held space for them when they couldn't hold space for themselves. You stayed calm when they withdrew. You tried to understand their silence, their distance, their emotional walls. You adapted to their needs, sometimes at the cost of your own. You learned to read their moods, their triggers, their patterns. You became emotionally intelligent for two people. But they didn't see that as something valuable. To them, it was just how things were. They assumed you would always be there to fill the emotional gaps they refused to face. They didn't realize how much emotional labor you were carrying. They didn't realize how rare it is to find someone willing to stay patient with an emotionally unavailable person. And while you were trying to get closer, they were practicing the push-pull cycle. One moment they were warm, affectionate, present. The next moment they were distant, cold, unavailable. This inconsistency kept you emotionally engaged, always hoping for the warm version of them to return. The push-pull dynamic is not accidental, it's a defense mechanism. When they feel close, they panic and pull away. When they feel distant, they fear losing you and pull you back in. This cycle creates confusion, emotional addiction, and deep attachment for their partner. For you, it felt like emotional whiplash. For them, it felt like safety. Distance made them feel in control. Closeness made them feel threatened. And you were constantly caught in the middle, trying to find a balance that didn't exist. They didn't realize how draining this was for you. They didn't realize how much emotional confusion they created. They didn't realize that every time they pulled away, you questioned your worth. They didn't realize that every time they returned, you hoped it would be different. And now, they're the ones sitting in that emotional space you once occupied. They're the ones feeling the push and pull inside themselves. They're the ones feeling the absence where your presence used to be. They thought they were strong by not needing anyone. They thought independence meant emotional isolation. They thought vulnerability was weakness. But loneliness has a way of teaching lessons that no relationship ever could. And somewhere in that quiet, somewhere in that loneliness, they start to realize what you were. Not just a partner, not just someone who cared, but someone who offered emotional connection in a world where they learned to shut it down. They may never say it, they may never admit it, but the realization exists, and it changes them. Even if they don't show it, they're lonely now. And this is what they never realized about you. You were the connection they secretly needed, the emotional presence they feared, and the love they didn't know how to receive. And the realization doesn't come all at once. It comes in fragments, in late-night thoughts, in moments of silence, in memories they didn't know would hurt this much. They replay conversations. They remember how you looked at them with hope. They remember how you tried to reach them emotionally, even when they shut down. And slowly, something inside them starts to crack. The push-pull cycle they created now plays inside their own mind. One moment, they tell themselves they're better off alone. The next moment, they feel an ache they can't explain. They miss the way you used to check in on them. They miss the emotional warmth they pretended not to need. They miss the version of themselves that only existed when you were around. When you were chasing them, when you were trying to get closer, when you were asking for reassurance, they felt powerful. They felt in control. They felt desired. Your emotional investment gave them a sense of superiority and safety. They knew you cared more, and that gave them leverage. Avoidants often feel most secure when someone else is emotionally invested. It allows them to stay detached while still benefiting from connection. They could keep one foot out the door and still receive love, attention, validation, and emotional support. They didn't have to fully show up. They didn't have to risk vulnerability. They didn't have to change. Your chasing validated them. Your patience reassured them. Your consistency grounded them. And instead of recognizing how valuable that was, they took it as something that would never disappear. They believed you would always be there, always understanding, always forgiving, always waiting. But something changed when you stopped chasing, when you stopped explaining, when you stopped trying to pull them closer, when you stopped initiating, when you stopped caring in the way you used to. At first, they felt relief. No pressure, no expectations, no emotional demands. They thought this was what they wanted. But then they noticed the absence, the lack of messages, the silence where your presence used to be. The emotional space that once felt suffocating now felt empty. And that's when the realization begins. Not as a dramatic movie moment, but as a quiet psychological shift. They realize no one is waiting for them to open up. No one is asking how they feel. No one is trying to break down their walls. No one is loving them in the way you did. Their ego fights this realization. They tell themselves they don't care. They convince themselves they're fine. They distract themselves with work, friends, dating, or endless scrolling. But when they're alone, when distractions fade, the emotional truth surfaces. Their ego says, "You didn't need them." Their heart whispers, "But you miss them." This internal conflict is painful for avoidants because they built their identity around not needing anyone. Admitting they miss you feels like admitting vulnerability. It feels like losing control. It feels like exposing a part of themselves they've spent years hiding. So they suppress it, they rationalize it, they minimize it, but suppression doesn't erase emotion, it delays it. And delayed emotions tend to resurface stronger. They start noticing how quiet their life feels without you, how empty conversations feel, how shallow connections feel. They realize that while they kept emotional distance, you were the one bringing depth, empathy, and emotional presence into their life. Avoidants often don't talk about their loneliness. On the surface, they appear independent, confident, self-sufficient. They pride themselves on not needing anyone. But underneath, many of them feel deeply isolated. They crave connection but fear it. They want intimacy but distrust it. They desire closeness but panic when it arrives. You are a contradiction to their beliefs. You showed them that connection could be safe, that vulnerability could be gentle, that love didn't have to be overwhelming. But instead of leaning into that, they ran from it. Now without you, they feel the consequences of emotional avoidance. They may have friends, dates, social interactions, but emotional intimacy feels missing. Conversations feel surface level, relationships feel replaceable, and they start realizing that what they had with you was rare. What they never realized about you is how emotionally intelligent you were. You didn't just love them, you tried to understand them. You noticed their patterns. You sensed when they were pulling away. You adjusted your behavior to not trigger their fears. You carried emotional awareness for both of you. You gave them space when they needed it. You reassured them when they doubted. You stayed patient when they shut down. You didn't just demand closeness, you tried to create safety. That level of emotional attunement is rare, and they didn't see it as a gift. They saw it as something ordinary, something guaranteed. They didn't realize that many people would have walked away much earlier. Many people would not have tolerated the emotional distance, the inconsistency, the hot and cold behavior. Many people would not have tried to understand their attachment style, their fears, their internal struggles. You were their safe place, but they thought you were the problem. When they felt overwhelmed, they blamed you. When they felt pressured, they blamed you. When they felt discomfort, they blamed you. They didn't realize that intimacy was triggering their internal wounds, not your behavior. You weren't too much. You weren't demanding. You weren't needy. You were asking for connection in a relationship, and that is normal, that is healthy, that is human. They mistook their discomfort with closeness as proof that something was wrong with you. In reality, something inside them was afraid of being seen, known, and emotionally connected. And now, in the absence of your presence, they begin to see the truth. You were never the problem. You were the opportunity for healing, for connection, for growth. But they didn't know how to receive that. This realization can be painful, confusing, and destabilizing. Some avoidants double down on their defenses. They become more detached. They avoid thinking about you. They move on quickly on the surface. Others feel a deep sense of regret, nostalgia, and emotional longing they don't know how to express. They might stalk your social media. They might think about reaching out. They might replay memories and wonder what went wrong. They might feel an urge to reconnect, but fear vulnerability and rejection. And while all of this is happening inside them, you are on your own journey. You are processing the emotional confusion, the self-doubt, the heartbreak. You are rebuilding your self-worth. your boundaries, your identity. The truth is, their loneliness is not your responsibility. Their realization is not your burden. Their delayed understanding does not erase the emotional cost you paid while trying to love them. But knowing that they are lonely now can be validating. It can be healing to understand that you were not invisible. You were not insignificant. You were not easily replaceable. You mattered more than they knew how to acknowledge. And that knowledge is not for them. It is for you, to remind you that your emotional presence was powerful, that your love was meaningful, that your connection was real. They're lonely now, and they're starting to realize what you were. But your story doesn't end with their realization. It begins with your awakening to your own worth, your own emotional power, and your own ability to choose a connection that meets you fully. And as they sit with that realization, something else slowly surfaces. A deeper awareness of what you truly brought into their life. Not just affection, not just companionship, but a level of emotional intelligence that most people never experience in a partner. You didn't just react, you observed. You sensed emotional shifts before words were spoken. You noticed when they withdrew and tried to understand why. You felt when something was wrong, even when they pretended everything was fine. You tried to communicate without attacking. You tried to connect without suffocating. You tried to love without losing yourself, even though at times you did lose pieces of yourself in the process. They never realized how rare that was. They never realized how many people would have walked away at the first sign of emotional unavailability. They never realized that your emotional awareness was not weakness, but strength. And now, in their loneliness, they start to feel the absence of that emotional presence. They start to realize that conversations with others feel different, less deep, less intuitive, less emotionally attuned. They realize that you were reading between the lines when they were still learning how to read their own emotions. And slowly they begin to understand that you were their safe place. Even when they couldn't admit it, you were the one who made them feel accepted, even when they felt emotionally broken inside. You were the one who didn't demand perfection, only honesty. You were the one who tried to build emotional safety, even when they kept their guard up. But when they felt overwhelmed, they turned that discomfort into blame. Instead of asking themselves why closeness felt scary, they assumed you were the source of the pressure. Instead of exploring their fear of intimacy, they pushed you away. Instead of recognizing your emotional effort, they minimized it. They thought you were the problem because facing their own emotional wounds was too painful. It was easier to believe that love was suffocating than to admit that vulnerability terrified them. Now, with you gone, that illusion begins to crumble. They start to see that the discomfort they felt wasn't because you were too much. It was because intimacy required them to confront parts of themselves they had buried for years. They begin to see memories differently. Moments they once dismissed now feel significant. Conversations they brushed off now replay in their mind. The way you tried to explain your feelings, the way you tried to connect, the way you tried to build something stable, they start to see the patience in your actions, the loyalty in your presence, the emotional maturity in your words. And with that comes a haunting thought: they may never find that again in the same way. Avoidants often believe they can replace connection easily. They think emotional bonds are interchangeable, but when they lose someone who truly understood them, someone who adapted to their emotional world, someone who offered consistent presence without control, they begin to realize that not every connection is equal. This realization often triggers a desire to return. They feel nostalgia, they feel regret, they feel a sudden urge to reach out. They remember the comfort of your voice, the familiarity of your energy, the safety of your emotional presence. They may start to check your social media. They may reread old messages. They may replay moments when you laughed together, when you opened up, when you tried to get closer. And in those moments they feel a strange mix of longing and fear. Longing because they miss you, fear because reconnecting means facing vulnerability. This is why Avoidants often return after a breakup, not always out of manipulation, but out of delayed emotional awareness. They feel the loss when it's no longer reversible. They feel attachment when it's no longer safe. They feel closeness when it's no longer available. But even if they return, the pain they feel now is part of a delayed emotional timeline. Avoidants often process grief later than others. While you were grieving during the relationship, while you were questioning your worth, while you were emotionally exhausted, they were emotionally numb. They didn't feel the loss because it hadn't happened yet. Now the emotional processing begins. They feel what they avoided feeling. They experience sadness, loneliness, regret, confusion. They question their decisions. They wonder if they made a mistake. They wonder if they pushed away something meaningful. And while they are feeling this, you are likely in a different phase. You are healing. You are reflecting. You are learning. You are rebuilding. You did things they will miss forever. You showed up consistently. You cared deeply. You tried to communicate. You offered emotional support. You gave reassurance. You stayed loyal. You tried to make the relationship work even when it felt one-sided. These are not small things. These are foundational elements of a healthy relationship, and they didn't realize their value until they were gone. Many avoidants assume they will always find someone else who will be patient, understanding, emotionally available, and loyal. But over time, they may realize that not everyone is willing to tolerate emotional distance. Not everyone is willing to chase. Not everyone is willing to wait. They may date others who mirror their emotional detachment. They may experience relationships that feel shallow, disconnected, or transactional. And in those moments, they may remember you, the person who offered depth, warmth, and emotional presence. Regret in avoidant attachment is complex. It is often mixed with self-justification. They may tell themselves they had valid reasons. They may blame timing, circumstances, or compatibility. But beneath those rationalizations, there is often a quiet awareness that fear played a role. They realize that their fear of intimacy cost them connection, that their avoidance cost them love, that their emotional walls protected them from pain, but also blocked them from joy. But here is the truth that matters most for you. Their realization does not change what you experienced. Their loneliness does not erase the emotional confusion, the self-doubt, the unanswered questions, the nights you felt alone while still in the relationship. You cannot build your healing on their regret. You cannot wait for their awakening to validate your worth. You cannot pause your growth, hoping they will change. Their journey is theirs. Your journey is yours. And your journey is about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were lost in the push-pull cycle. It is about remembering who you were before you questioned your worth. It is about recognizing that your emotional needs were valid. It is about choosing a connection that meets you with the same emotional presence you offer. They may learn their lesson too late. They may grow. They may repeat patterns. They may change or they may not. But you are not responsible for being their teacher, their healer, or their second chance. You were their connection, their emotional anchor, their safe place. They didn't realize it when it mattered. And now, as they sit with loneliness and reflection, they begin to see what you were. But your story is not about being remembered by them. Your story is about remembering yourself. And as time passes, something else begins to unfold inside them. A deeper, more unsettling emotion than loneliness. Regret. Not the dramatic kind that shows up in movies, but the quiet, haunting awareness that something meaningful was lost because of fear. Avoidants often rewrite the past to protect themselves. They minimize relationships. They downplay emotional bonds. They tell themselves it wasn't that serious. But regret has a way of slipping through even the strongest defenses. They begin to remember small details they once ignored. The way you looked at them when you were trying to connect, the way you tried to communicate without blaming, the way you stayed even when you felt unseen. Those memories start to feel heavier with time. Regret for an avoidant is confusing. They don't just regret losing you, they regret the version of themselves they could have been if they had allowed love in. They regret the intimacy they avoided. They regret the emotional growth they postponed. They regret the moments they missed because they were too busy protecting themselves. But instead of openly processing that regret, many avoidants bury it. They rationalize, they distract themselves, they move on quickly on the surface. Yet internally, something remains unresolved. A subtle emotional echo that reminds them of what they pushed away. And here's the harsh truth. This regret often arrives too late. While they are still trying to understand what they lost, you are already transforming. You are already stepping into a version of yourself that no longer chases emotionally unavailable people. You are already learning to recognize emotional consistency, safety, and mutual effort. Leaving an avoidant changes you. It forces you to confront your own patterns, your own boundaries, your own emotional needs. It pushes you to stop over-giving, stop over-explaining, stop over-waiting. It teaches you that love should not feel like a puzzle you have to solve alone. You begin to see how much emotional energy you invested in someone who couldn't meet you halfway. You begin to see how much of yourself you put on hold. And instead of feeling shame, you begin to feel compassion for yourself. You realize you were not foolish for loving deeply. You were brave. You were emotionally available in a world that often rewards emotional distance. And that is not a weakness. That is a strength. As you heal, something powerful happens. You start to reclaim your identity outside of the relationship. You reconnect with your interests, your passions, your self-worth. You begin to feel whole again, without needing someone else to validate your emotions. And this is where the true shift happens. You stop measuring your worth by how they treated you. You stop wondering if you were too much or not enough. You start understanding that you were simply in a dynamic where emotional availability and emotional avoidance collided. The lesson avoidants eventually learn is that love requires vulnerability. That emotional connection requires risk. That closeness requires courage. They learn that independence without intimacy is not freedom. It's isolation. But they often learn this lesson through loss, through silence, through the absence of someone who once tried to love them openly. They may look back and realize that they had a chance to build something real. They may understand that you were offering emotional connection, not control. They may see that your requests for closeness were not demands, but invitations. Yet by the time they understand, you are no longer the person who is waiting. You are no longer the person who is chasing. You are no longer the person who is trying to convince someone to choose you. You have chosen yourself, and that is the most powerful ending to this story. Not their regret, not their loneliness, not their realization, but your awakening. You awaken to the truth that love should not be forced, that connection should not be one-sided, that emotional safety should not be something you have to beg for. You awaken to the understanding that your emotional intelligence, your empathy, your loyalty, your patience, these are qualities that deserve to be reciprocated, not exploited. You awaken to the reality that you deserve someone who doesn't run when things get real, someone who doesn't shut down when you open up, someone who doesn't pull away when you reach for connection. And while avoidants sit with their loneliness, their regret, their delayed understanding, you are moving forward. You are attracting healthier connections. You are setting stronger boundaries. You are loving yourself with the same intensity you once gave them. One day, they may fully realize what they lost. They may understand your value in ways they never did before. They may even reach out, hoping to reconnect, hoping to revisit what once was. But by then, you will be different, not hardened, not closed off, but wiser, stronger, more grounded in your self-worth. You will no longer chase someone who cannot meet you emotionally. You will no longer settle for emotional breadcrumbs. You will understand that love is not about convincing someone to see your value. Love is about mutual recognition, mutual effort, mutual vulnerability. So if you are listening to this and you loved an avoidant, remember this. Their loneliness is not your burden, but it is proof that your presence mattered. Their regret is not your responsibility, but it is evidence that your love was real, and your growth is not dependent on their realization. Your growth is your power. One day, they may fully understand what you were to them, but by that time you will be too busy understanding what you are to yourself, and that is the ultimate transformation.